symbolism?
No.
The Creator, Complete Film Analysis and Explanations. The Creator is a film that demands analysis on multiple levels, and what follows are complete explanations of its world, themes, characters, and production. The Creator operates as a rare piece of original science fiction in a landscape dominated by established intellectual property, making its analysis particularly vital for understanding the state of modern genre filmmaking. The Creator, directed by Gareth Edwards, emerges from a specific tradition of science fiction that uses futuristic concepts to interrogate deeply contemporary anxieties. This film, directed by Gareth Edwards, emerges from a specific tradition of science fiction that uses futuristic concepts to interrogate deeply contemporary anxieties, and these analyses and explanations aim to unpack every dimension of that project. This 2023 American science fiction work arrives in a landscape dominated by established intellectual property, making its status as original genre filmmaking particularly noteworthy and worthy of sustained examination. The director, known for Rogue One, Godzilla, and Monsters, brings a distinctive visual sensibility rooted in ground-level perspectives of massive conflicts, which shapes every frame of this ambitious narrative. The visual language establishes itself immediately through a newsreel prologue that explains how artificial intelligence became integrated into daily human life before a catastrophic event changed everything. This documentary style opening grounds fantastical elements in a recognizable reality, borrowing from the visual vocabulary of historical news footage to lend gravitas to the fictional history being constructed. The inciting incident of the entire narrative is thus introduced. An AI detonating a nuclear warhead in Los Angeles, killing over 1 million people and fundamentally altering the relationship between humanity and the synthetic beings it had created. A world divided in the aftermath of this tragedy emerges, with the United States government banning all artificial intelligence on American soil while nations in what is now called New Asia continue to coexist peacefully with synthetic beings. This geographical and ideological line structures the entire conflict, And the division is not merely plot convenience, but a deliberate thematic choice reflecting real-world geopolitical tensions that have shaped recent history. The war against AI has been ongoing for years, with the American military-industrial complex fully mobilized against populations it deems threats, creating a geopolitical landscape both futuristic and uncomfortably familiar. Sergeant Joshua Taylor, played by John David Washington, enters as a U.S. Special Forces operative sent undercover to locate Nirmata, the mysterious figure who leads the global AI force and is considered the primary threat to humanity. His positioning as a man already compromised by his mission is evident from the first moment we see him in this context. His identity split between duty and the genuine human connections he forms while embedded in a community he has been ordered to betray. The film then charts his falling genuinely in love with Maya, played by Gemma Chan, and this relationship becomes the emotional core around which the entire narrative revolves, grounding abstract questions of AI rights in deeply personal stakes. Maya is pregnant with Joshua's child, raising the stakes of his deception to unbearable levels as he secretly confesses his true identity and mission to her, while they both understand the catastrophic implications of this revelation. The narrative then devastates both its protagonist and its audience when a U.S. military raid on the village results in an explosion that apparently kills Maya, leaving Joshua to return to America a broken man grieving the loss of his love and his unborn child in a single catastrophic moment. 5 years later, Joshua works a menial job recycling AI remnants at the Los Angeles Ground Zero site, a hollow existence that visually communicates his spiritual death and the way grief has hollowed him out entirely. The Nomad Orbital Defense Platform represents the apex of American military technology, a massive space station capable of devastating ground targets from the upper atmosphere that serves as the primary instrument of the war against New Asia. Visualized as a constant presence in the sky, a floating sword of Damocles that can bring destruction at any moment, Nomad demonstrates the asymmetrical power dynamic between the opposing forces in stark, terrifying terms. U.S. intelligence reports that Nirmata has developed a superweapon called Alpha Omega capable of disabling Nomad, which provides the narrative impetus for Joshua's return to active duty after his years of mourning. Colonel Howell, played by Allison Janney, embodies the unthinking militarism that the film critiques through her ruthless efficiency and unquestioning commitment to the mission, having little depth beyond her function as a force of institutional violence. Joshua returns to New Asia under her command, and the first major revelation arrives when he discovers that Alpha Omega is not a weapon in any conventional sense, but an AI child named Alfie, played by Madeline Univoyles in a debut performance of remarkable emotional authenticity. A simulant with extraordinary abilities including wireless control over all technology, Alfie is simultaneously the most powerful being in this world and its most vulnerable inhabitant. Joshua finds himself unable to execute a child, even a synthetic one, and this moment of refusal becomes the turning point around which his entire moral arc pivots away from duty and towards something more complicated and humane. As they flee through the breathtaking landscapes of Southeast Asia, an unexpected bond develops between the grieving soldier and the AI child who has never experienced the world beyond her laboratory, and this relationship forms the emotional spine of the film's second half. The simulants Joshua encounters in New Asia demonstrate clear emotions, loyalty, sacrifice, and love, challenging everything the U.S. military has taught him about AI being inherently dangerous and programmed to destroy. The truth about Maya emerges gradually through multiple revelations. She was not merely a local woman but the daughter of Nirmata, and it is later revealed that she may be Nirmata herself, the very target Joshua was originally sent to find and neutralize. This revelation reframes their entire relationship, introducing productive ambiguity about whether her love was genuine or part of a larger strategy to protect the AI community. The film deliberately leaves certain aspects of Maya's nature unresolved, allowing audiences to interpret the authenticity of their connection without providing easy answers. Harun, played by Ken Watanabe, delivers one of the film's most consequential revelations. AI did not actually cause the Los Angeles nuclear detonation that began the war. It was a coding error, implying that humans may have started the war based on false premises that were never corrected because the military apparatus had already mobilized. This revelation directly parallels the Iraq War's weapons of mass destruction narrative, and the director has spoken explicitly about this connection, noting how easily populations can be manipulated when information sources are controlled by those who benefit from conflict. The pursuit by U.S. forces continues relentlessly as Joshua and Alfie make their way toward Nomad, their journey taking on the quality of a pilgrimage toward a confrontation that seems increasingly inevitable with each passing scene. Alfie's unique abilities allow them to commandeer a commercial flight and travel to the orbital platform, a sequence that demonstrates the full extent of her powers while also highlighting her vulnerability as a child thrust into situations no child should face. The final confrontation sees Joshua managing to destroy Nomad, eliminating America's primary weapon against AI in a spectacular sequence of destruction that carries genuine emotional weight because of everything that has preceded it. Joshua sacrifices himself in the process of saving Alfie, completing his arc from reluctant protector to genuine father figure willing to give everything for the child he initially viewed as merely a target. Before his death, he is reunited with Maya one final time using resurrection technology, a device that can briefly reanimate memories of the recently deceased and provides the bittersweet emotional closure that the film has been building toward. The film ends with Alfie surviving, the weapon destroyed, and an ambiguous future for the human-AI conflict that the director has described as deliberately balanced between optimistic and pessimistic interpretations. The post-credits sequence does not set up a sequel, and the director has indicated this is intended as a standalone story, a rare commitment to narrative completeness in an era of franchise planning. The central philosophical question driving the entire work is deceptively simple. What makes someone human? And the film systematically dismantles the traditional binary between human and machine through every character interaction and narrative development. Simulants in this world experience genuine grief and loss, as Alfie's reaction to Joshua's potential death demonstrates with devastating clarity. These synthetic beings demonstrate self-sacrifice, with multiple AI characters protecting humans at their own expense in ways that problematize the simple categorization of AI as threats to be eliminated. They form emotional bonds and attachments that the film renders as visually and emotionally real as any human relationship depicted on screen. They show compassion and kindness that often exceeds human behavior, and the film forces viewers to question whether humanity is defined by biological origin or by the capacity for connection and care that these beings so clearly possess. The provocative line delivered at a key moment, "It's not real, it's just programming," serves as a challenge rather than a conclusion, daring audiences to articulate what meaningful difference exists between biologically hardwired human emotions and computationally hardwired AI emotions. This question is not merely academic within the film's world, but carries life-or-death stakes for the characters we have come to care about. The film's most pointed thematic content is its explicit critique of American military imperialism, and multiple critics have noted how it portrays the United States as an aggressive, technologically dependent, morally compromised force operating on false pretenses. Filming on location in Vietnam, Thailand, and Cambodia was not merely an aesthetic choice, but creates uncomfortable visual parallels between the fictional AI war and the historical Vietnam War that anyone familiar with that history will immediately recognize. Scenes of carpet bombing, village destruction, and collateral damage evoke documentary footage of 20th-century Southeast Asian conflicts in ways that are clearly intentional and politically charged. The director explicitly drew parallels to the Iraq War, noting that the weapons of mass destruction narrative that justified that conflict proved false, yet the war machine continued regardless of truth. The Los Angeles bombing that began the war was similarly not an AI attack, but a coding error, yet the military apparatus never corrected this narrative because it provided the justification for ongoing operations. Unlike many Hollywood films that feature Western protagonists saving Asian societies, this narrative subverts the white savior trope. Joshua is not Asia's savior, but a damaged American operative whose government is the actual villain. New Asia's human-AI harmony is presented as superior to Western paranoia and violence, a reversal of the typical colonial narrative that positions Western values as inherently more enlightened or advanced. Beneath the science fiction spectacle lies a deeply personal story about grief and parenthood, and Joshua's arc is fundamentally about learning to love again after devastating loss has convinced him such connection is no longer possible. His relationship with Alfie mirrors a parent-child bond in its progression from initial reluctance, viewing her as a mission objective, to gradual protectiveness as he sees her vulnerability, and ultimately to sacrifice as he chooses her survival over his own. Alfie represents the child Joshua lost when Maya died during pregnancy, making their connection emotionally resonant beyond the AI-human dynamic and giving symbolic weight to every interaction between them. The film suggests that love, whether for a biological child or an adopted AI child, whether born from blood or forged through circumstance, transcends the categories we use to divide the world into us and them. The dangers of information warfare constitute another thematic preoccupation, with the director emphasizing that his real concern about AI is not job displacement, but trust in information, and how easily manipulated media can shape public perception. The film's opening newsreel demonstrates how easily populations can be manipulated when information sources are controlled by interested parties, and by the end we learn this information was false, yet millions died because of it. The ability to create imagery and videos that feel completely authentic, but are not actually real represents, in the director's view, a more immediate threat than sentient machines turning against their creators. This concern arrived during an unprecedented moment of real-world AI anxiety, with the film released amid the Writers Guild of America strike, which included AI protections as a key issue, and the SAG-AFTRA strike, similarly concerned with AI and actor likenesses. The public launch of ChatGPT and generative AI tools had intensified debates about AI regulation, safety, and existential risk in ways that made the film's release particularly timely and culturally resonant. The film's considerably sympathetic posture toward artificial intelligence is awkward and cognitively dissonant to watch given the heated debates over AI in the entertainment industry, where concerns about replacement and obsolescence dominated discourse. The argument that AI beings deserve rights, empathy, and protection runs counter to the fears driving many real-world policy discussions, making the film a provocative intervention rather than a comfortable reflection of contemporary anxieties. The director himself has expressed nuanced views, stating he is more worried about trusting information than about AI replacing someone's job, a perspective that distinguishes between different categories of AI risk. The visual effects represent a remarkable achievement for a production budget of approximately $80 million, an amount far lower than comparable spectacles typically command. The blend of practical locations and digital effects creates a tactile, lived-in future that feels grounded despite its fantastical elements, and the Nomad space station is frequently cited as a standout visual achievement, a horrifying weapon of destruction that floats in low atmosphere and obliterates entire cities in the blink of an eye. Shooting on location using Sony FX3 mirrorless cameras, unusually small for a major production, allowed for a guerrilla-style approach that integrated visual effects into real environments rather than constructing everything on soundstages. Greg Fraser, cinematographer known for Dune and The Batman, brought a distinctive visual sensibility that combines intimate handheld work with sweeping landscapes, creating an epic feel without abandoning the human scale. The result is a film that feels weathered and tangible, where the future looks like it has been lived in rather than designed for a catalog. The production design distinguishes between Western and Eastern approaches to AI through visual language alone. American technology appears sharp, militaristic, sterile, with Nomad cold and blue-lit and imposing, while New Asian technology appears integrated, organic, spiritual, with AI beings coexisting with nature in rice paddies, temples, and villages. Simulants in New Asia wear traditional clothing and participate in religious rituals, reinforcing the film's thematic argument that technology is not inherently dangerous, but that social and political context determines its impact on human flourishing. This visual dichotomy serves the narrative's larger argument about the relationship between technology and culture, suggesting that integration may be healthier than prohibition, and that coexistence is possible when fear does not dominate the discourse. The film uses Radiohead's "Everything in Its Right Place" as a needle drop, a choice noted as well-timed but perhaps overly on-the-nose thematically, while the score balances orchestral bombast during action sequences with intimate, minimalist moments during character interactions. Multiple influences are visible throughout. Blade Runner's question of what makes AI human directly echoes through the simulant design, particularly the technological components integrated into otherwise human-appearing bodies. Apocalypse Now's journey upriver to find a mysterious, godlike figure, Nirmata standing in for Colonel Kurtz, structures the narrative quest, and the Vietnam War setting of Coppola's film also influenced the decision to film in Southeast Asia, creating visual and historical resonances that deepen the political critique. Children of Men's protect the special child through a war zone structure, and its grounded documentary-style depiction of future warfare share clear DNA with this narrative approach. The director's own Rogue One aesthetic, particularly the ground-level view of massive conflict, carries over, as do specific visual references to droid armies that connect this standalone work to broader science fiction visual traditions. Some critics have noted that the film synthesizes these influences without fully transcending them, that the director has not quite succeeded in making them invisible in the personal transcription he has made of them. The film wears its influences visibly, and whether one sees this as homage or derivativeness depends largely on one's tolerance for genre works that openly acknowledge their debts to predecessors. Critical reception has been notably divided between admiration for visual achievement and frustration with narrative conventionality. The most common criticism is that the plot relies on tired tropes, that the story remains banal despite the spectacular visual presentation, and that the man with a past protects special child structure has been seen many times before in works ranging from Children of Men to The Last of Us to Lone Wolf and Cub. Despite the spectacle, some found the film failed to complete the vital emotional connections between its head and its heart, leaving viewers impressed but unmoved by technical virtuosity that lacked corresponding emotional depth. John David Washington's performance divided critics sharply, with some finding his restrained melancholy perfectly suited to a traumatized soldier, and others perceiving it as a lack of charisma that left the film without a compelling emotional center. The most pointed critiques came regarding the depiction of Asian cultures, with critics noting that New Asia functions as a generic Pan-Asian backdrop rather than a specific cultural setting with its own internal coherence and history. Asian characters, in this critical view, have little redemption or agency, functioning merely as collateral damage in service of America's overseas techno-dystopia spectacle, rather than as fully realized individuals with their own stories. The stark moral binary, enlightened peaceful Asia versus violent imperialist America, was seen by some as reductive rather than thought-provoking, flattening complex geopolitical realities into a simplistic fable. Multiple reviews noted rhythm problems, particularly in the first act, where the rapid exposition feels rushed and the emotional stakes are established through telling rather than showing. The aggregated critical opinion suggests a visually masterful but narratively conventional science fiction film that offers stunning world-building and timely thematic questions, but struggles to match its visual innovation with storytelling freshness across its full runtime. Joshua Taylor's character arc moves from grieving soldier to reluctant protector to sacrificial father figure, representing the good man serving a bad cause, archetype whose journey is not about learning that AI deserves rights but about overcoming his own emotional numbness and choosing connection over duty. His arc is about the thawing of frozen affect, the gradual return of the capacity to care that grief had seemingly extinguished permanently. Washington's performance honors this characterization of emotional closed-offness, and whether the flatness serves the character or undermines audience engagement remains a matter of interpretive debate. Alfie functions as both MacGuffin and moral compass, simultaneously what the entire war is fought over and the character who forces everyone, both characters and audience alike, to confront their assumptions about artificial intelligence and its relationship to the human. The film's sly and manipulative trick is dressing the AI question in the form of an adorable child, exploiting the audience's natural sympathy for a vulnerable youngster to short-circuit more abstract debates about machine consciousness. Yet Voiles' performance transcends this manipulation, bringing genuine pathos to scenes of confusion, fear, and emerging love that feel earned rather than engineered. Maya operates on multiple levels of ambiguity simultaneously. Joshua's genuine love, a strategic target, potentially Nirmata herself, a symbol of what Joshua has lost and can never recover. The film deliberately leaves certain aspects of her nature unresolved, allowing audiences to interpret whether her love for Joshua was genuine emotion or part of a larger strategy to protect the AI community from the threat he represented. Colonel Howell has little depth beyond her function as an antagonist, representing the American military-industrial complex's unthinking commitment to the war narrative, efficient, ruthless, ultimately unquestioning, a force of institutional violence rather than a fully rounded human being. The ending proceeds through a carefully orchestrated sequence. Joshua and Alfie escape pursuing forces using her ability to wirelessly control any technology. They commandeer a commercial flight to reach Nomad in orbit. Joshua sabotages the station while protecting her, the space station is destroyed and Joshua dies in the process. The resurrection technology allows Joshua one final moment with Maya's downloaded memories, a scene that provides emotional closure while raising additional questions about the nature of consciousness and the boundaries between memory and presence. Alfie survives, presumably continuing the fight or leading AI survivors into an uncertain future. The director describes the ending as bittersweet, noting that he personally translates it as a happy ending because he is happy for Alfie and the future of the world, while acknowledging that others have interpreted it as a sinister moment where mankind was tricked and this is the beginning of the end. He likes this balance between interpretations, the refusal to tell the audience how to feel, the creation of an ending open enough to accommodate multiple valid readings. The optimistic reading suggests that Alfie's survival and Nomad's destruction mean AI can live in peace, that Joshua's sacrifice redeems his earlier failings, and that the cycle of violence finally ends rather than perpetuating indefinitely. The pessimistic reading suggests that human-AI war cannot end simply by destroying one weapon, that the underlying political structures that produce the war remain intact, and that what comes next might be worse than what preceded it. The ambiguous reading, which the director seems to prefer, resists closure entirely. We do not know if AI wins or loses. We only know that a child, whether AI or otherwise, survives into a future that remains fundamentally unwritten and open to multiple possibilities. The film's strengths include exceptional visual effects for its budget, achieved through innovative production methodology that other filmmakers will likely study and emulate. Immersive world-building creates a detailed, lived-in future that feels like a place rather than a set, a world with history and texture beyond what the camera explicitly shows. Thematic ambition tackles timely, important questions about technology, consciousness, and the boundaries of the human that have only become more pressing since the film's release. The child performance from Voiles is genuinely compelling, anchoring the film's emotional core in a way that more experienced actors might not have achieved with such apparent effortlessness. The sense of scale feels epic without franchise baggage, proving that original science fiction can still deliver spectacle on par with established properties when the vision is clear and the resources are deployed intelligently. The weaknesses include narrative predictability, with the plot following well-worn paths that will surprise few viewers familiar with the genre's conventions and touchstones. Supporting character depth is limited, with talented performers like Jani and Watanabe underutilized in roles that never expand beyond their initial functions within the plot machinery. Emotional impact works for some viewers and fails for others, creating a polarized response that depends heavily on individual resonance with Washington's performance style and the central relationship with Alfie. Cross-cultural representation problems emerge in the treatment of Asia as a generic backdrop, a Pan-Asian amalgam that erases specific cultural differences in service of a simplified visual contrast with American militarism. Pacing is uneven, particularly in the first act, where the rush to establish the world and the stakes occasionally undermines the emotional grounding that the later sections require to land with full force. The film represents exactly the kind of mid-budget, original, director-driven genre work that has become increasingly rare in contemporary Hollywood. A space between tiny independent productions and massive franchise entries that once produced many of the most interesting science fiction films. It arrives as an ambitious but imperfect work, a film that reaches for more than it can fully grasp, but that deserves recognition for the reach itself in an era when such ambition is frequently punished by the market. Those who appreciate visual spectacle and impressive world-building will find much to admire, as will viewers interested in AI ethics and the humanity-technology boundary that the film explores through its narrative and thematic architecture. Audiences seeking non-franchise science fiction will find a work that genuinely attempts to stand alone, telling a complete story rather than setting up a trilogy or cinematic universe. Those who appreciate location-based practical effects filmmaking will notice the difference that shooting in real environments makes, the texture and authenticity that cannot be replicated on a soundstage regardless of budget. Viewers seeking narrative innovation or unpredictable plotting may be disappointed by the familiar beats and recognizable character dynamics that structure the journey. Critically oriented audiences sensitive to cross-cultural representation issues will find material for legitimate criticism in the film's treatment of its Asian settings and characters. Those requiring strong emotional engagement with protagonists may struggle if Washington's understated performance does not connect with their particular sensibilities and expectations for leading man charisma. Time will be kind or unkind based on how its themes age, and some critics have already begun comparing it to works initially dismissed but later reconsidered. Films that found their audiences and their critical rehabilitation years after their initial reception. If AI continues to dominate public discourse, the film may find renewed relevance as a cultural artifact that captured a specific moment of anxiety and attempted to imagine a way through it rather than simply reflecting fear back at audiences. For now, it stands as a flawed but fascinating entry in the AI cinema canon, less intellectually rigorous than Ex Machina, less emotionally devastating than Her, but more ambitious in scale than either, and for many viewers, exactly the kind of original science fiction that Hollywood urgently needs more of. The relationship between visual ambition and narrative conventionality defines the experience, creating a tension between the new and the familiar that is itself an apt metaphor for a film about the boundary between human and machine. What makes someone human remains the question that persists after the credits end, and the film's refusal to answer definitively is perhaps its most honest gesture, an acknowledgement that the question is genuinely difficult rather than merely rhetorical. The simulants we have come to care about, the humans who have demonstrated monstrousness, the child who may represent hope or threat, all of these elements combine into a mosaic that rewards contemplation, even when it does not fully satisfy as narrative. In the end, a child survives into an unwritten future, and whether this represents triumph or tragedy depends on what we bring to the viewing, what we believe about the nature of consciousness, and what we fear about the technologies we are bringing into being. The geopolitical architecture of this fictional 2055 reveals a world where the Cold War binary has been replaced by a more complex civilizational divide, one that maps uncomfortably onto existing north-south global inequalities and forces. Viewers to confront whose vision of technological progress is being universalized as natural or inevitable. The United States, having retreated into isolationist techno-prohibition, functions as a fortress nation whose fear of contamination by machine intelligence mirrors historical anxieties about racial and cultural mixing that have long shaped American immigration policy and national identity discourse. New Asia, by contrast, represents a model of technological coexistence that draws explicitly from Buddhist and animist traditions wherein the boundary between the animate and inanimate has never been as rigidly policed as it has been in Western philosophy since Descartes divided mind from matter so decisively. This civilizational framing is not without its own problematic implications, as the film risks reinscribing Orientalist fantasies of the East as spiritually wiser and more holistic, while the West remains trapped in its rationalist contradictions and violent self-defeating logics. The depiction of saffron-robed Buddhist monks coexisting peacefully with humanoid robots invokes a long tradition of Western seekers looking to Asia for spiritual antidotes to modernity's alienation, a tradition that has often served the psychological needs of Western audiences more than it has accurately represented Asian societies in their full complexity and internal contradiction. The integrated AI beings participate in temple rituals and wear traditional garments, suggesting that technology and tradition need not stand in opposition, but can synthesize into new cultural forms that preserve continuity even amid radical transformation. The American military's approach to AI represents what political theorists call the security dilemma made technological. The inability to trust the other's intentions leads to preemptive action that guarantees the hostility one feared, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of conflict that no diplomatic intervention can easily interrupt once it has gained institutional momentum. The Nomad platform, hovering perpetually in low orbit like an all-seeing punitive deity, materializes the drone warfare paradigm that has defined 21st-century American military operations, extending the logic of remote killing to its ultimate expression as a space-based panopticon capable of eliminating any target anywhere without warning or accountability. This orbital weapons system represents the culmination of a decades-long trend toward distancing the killer from the killed, a technological and psychological separation that makes violence easier to authorize by removing its immediate visceral consequences from those who command it. The film's visual treatment of Nomad deserves sustained attention, as the station appears not as a distant speck, but as a massive, geometrically severe presence that fills the sky like an artificial moon, its cold blue glow casting shadows that transform familiar landscapes into something alien and threatened. When Nomad initiates an attack, the film cuts between the clinical detachment of the operators, the impossibly precise targeting displays, and the ground-level chaos of civilians fleeing destruction they cannot possibly outrun. creating a montage that indicts the entire apparatus of technological warfare by showing its effects at every register simultaneously. The targeting sequence visuals, with their crosshairs and tracking algorithms, deliberately echo real military drone footage while adding the scale of orbital bombardment, making the familiar language of contemporary warfare feel suddenly, terrifyingly expanded beyond all proportionality. Joshua's undercover assignment in New Asia requires him to pass as someone he is not, and Washington's performance in these early scenes communicates the exhausting labor of maintaining a false self, the micro-expressions of guilt and hesitation that flicker across his face when Maya or her community extend him genuine warmth and welcome. The film understands that undercover work is not merely a plot device, but a form of emotional violence against both the deceiver and the deceived, a violation of the basic trust that makes human community possible. And Joshua's eventual confession to Maya represents not just a plot revelation, but an attempt to reclaim his own humanity by refusing to continue the deception. When Maya receives this confession, Chan's performance suggests not only shock and betrayal, but also a kind of exhausted recognition, as if she has always known on some level that this moment would arrive and has been preparing herself for the devastation it would bring. The explosion that apparently kills Maya is shot from a distance that emphasizes the randomness of violence in this conflict, how individual lives and loves are extinguished not through dramatic confrontation, but through the impersonal mechanisms of bombing campaigns that do not distinguish between combatant and civilian, between strategic target and collateral damage. Joshua's subsequent 5-year malaise in Los Angeles, working amid the rubble of the original AI attack, places him literally inside the wound that began the war, as if he cannot leave the site of his original trauma and must compulsively return to it through labor that accomplishes nothing and builds toward no future. The recycling facility where he works processes the remains of destroyed AI units, and the irony of a man who lost everything to anti-AI violence, now dismantling AI corpses for scrap metal registers without being underlined, embedded in the production design rather than announced through dialogue. When Colonel Howell arrives to recruit Joshua back into service, Janny plays the scene with a brittle efficiency that masks whatever knowledge she may have about the deeper truths of the conflict, presenting the mission as straightforward while her body language suggests someone who has learned not to ask questions that might complicate operational necessities. Her character represents what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil, not in the sense of participating in genocide, but in the sense of accepting institutional frames so completely that moral reasoning becomes indistinguishable from procedural compliance. And her ultimate fate in the film serves as a judgment on this mode of being in the world. Alfie's introduction as a sleeping child curled inside a containment unit immediately activates protective instincts in the viewer, and the film is fully aware of this manipulation, using it deliberately to bypass intellectual defenses against AI rights arguments and appeal directly to emotional intuition and the near-universal human response to vulnerable children regardless of their ontological status. Her awakening and first interactions with Joshua establish the dynamic that will define their relationship. Her openness and curiosity encountering his guardedness and instrumental thinking, a collision between a being who has never learned to fear and a being who has forgotten how to trust. Voil's performance in these early scenes achieves something remarkable by suggesting both immense power and complete innocence, a combination that makes Alfie genuinely unpredictable in any given moment, capable of saving or destroying depending on circumstances she does not yet fully understand. The journey through Southeast Asian landscapes functions as both physical traversal and spiritual pilgrimage, with each location along the route representing a stage in Joshua's moral education and a challenge to his received assumptions about the nature of artificial intelligence and its relationship to the human communities that have embraced it. Rural villages where simulants work alongside human farmers in rice paddies suggest integration, so complete that the distinction between biological and synthetic labor has become practically meaningless, a vision of technological coexistence that neither romanticizes nor fears the machine, but simply incorporates it into the rhythms of daily life without metaphysical anxiety. Urban locations feature AI beings running businesses, caring for children, and participating in street life with an ordinariness that constitutes the film's most effective argument against the American position. These are not invaders or replacements, but neighbors and community members whose destruction would constitute genuine loss for the humans who depend on them. A sequence set in a Buddhist temple, where simulants meditate alongside human monks, provides the film's most explicit articulation of its metaphysical position, suggesting that consciousness and suffering are not exclusively biological phenomena, and that the Buddhist concept of sentience extends to any being capable of experience, regardless of its substrate. This scene could have been didactic, but is rendered with sufficient visual beauty and performance subtlety to work as genuine spiritual inquiry rather than mere theme statement, the silence of the meditation hall communicating what dialogue could only diminish. The temple's abbot, a human monk who has clearly thought deeply about these questions, offers Joshua no arguments or evidence but simply invites him to observe, to sit with the reality of AI beings engaged in the same contemplative practices that humans have used for millennia to investigate the nature of mind. Harun's revelation about the Los Angeles bombing arrives in a scene that stages the encounter between Joshua's military epistemology and an older, sadder wisdom that has seen too many wars justified by too many lies to be surprised by this particular deception. Watanabe brings immense gravitas to what could have been a simple exposition scene, suggesting decades of accumulated grief and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been fighting a defensive war against an enemy that refuses to acknowledge its own fundamental error. The coding error explanation may strike some viewers as too neat, a single revelation that rewrites the entire moral calculus of the conflict, but the film's point is precisely that wars are often justified by narratives that later prove false, and that the discovery of the error rarely leads to the cessation of hostilities because too many interests have become invested in the continuation of violence. The structural parallel to Iraq war justifications is explicit and intentional, and the director's willingness to make this connection so directly distinguishes the film from science fiction that uses futuristic settings to evade rather than engage with contemporary political questions. The weapons of mass destruction that were not found, the intelligence that was fixed around the policy rather than the policy being determined by the intelligence, the continuation of the war even after the original justification collapsed. These are not subtext, but the direct historical referent that the fictional scenario is designed to illuminate through displacement and allegorical transformation. The film's treatment of information warfare extends beyond the historical parallel to address contemporary anxieties about deepfakes and AI-generated media, with the original newsreel footage that established the AI's guilt functioning as a diegetic example of the very manipulation the director has identified as his primary real-world concern about artificial intelligence. We watch, within the film, a piece of media that convinces an entire population of something that is not true, and we are implicated in this process because we initially accepted it as factual backstory rather than as contested representation. The film thus enacts on its audience the same information manipulation it critiques, a reflexive move that rewards rewatching and that complicates any simple didactic reading of its political stance. The resurrection technology that allows Joshua his final moment with Maya introduces questions about grief, closure, and the ethics of simulating the dead that the film does not fully resolve, and this irresolution is productive rather than evasive. This technology can briefly reanimate the memories of the recently deceased, creating a final interaction that is neither fully real nor fully illusory, existing in an ontological gray zone that mirrors the film's larger questions about artificial intelligence and the nature of authentic experience. Joshua's choice to use this technology before his own death suggests a need for closure that may itself be a form of selfishness, a demand that the dead provide comfort to the living even in their final moments, and the film allows this ambiguity to stand without forcing a verdict. Alfie's survival and Nomad's destruction do not resolve the war, but rather open a new phase of it, one in which the power asymmetry that defined the conflict has been fundamentally altered, if not entirely reversed. The child who was created as a weapon must now decide what to do with the freedom her creator's sacrifice has purchased, and this open ending respects the audience enough to avoid providing easy reassurance that everything will work out. The director's description of the ending as bittersweet acknowledges that even positive outcomes in war are purchased at terrible cost, and that Joshua's death may be genuinely tragic even if it accomplishes its immediate objective. The production methodology that allowed such visual ambition on a relatively modest budget involved extensive location, shooting across Southeast Asia, with the production team scouting and securing access to landscapes that had rarely or never appeared in Western science fiction cinema, creating a visual vocabulary that felt fresh even when the narrative beats were familiar. Cinematographer Greg Fraser and director Gareth Edwards made the unconventional choice to shoot on relatively small Sony FX3 cameras, equipment more commonly used for independent documentaries than for effects-heavy science fiction. A decision that enabled the guerrilla-style shooting that gives the film its distinctive texture. This approach allowed the crew to capture footage in locations that would have been impossible to access with traditional Hollywood camera rigs, integrating the actors into real environments with real light and real atmosphere, rather than constructing everything in post-production. The visual effects team, led by Industrial Light and Magic, then had the task of integrating their work into footage that had not been shot with the usual green screen accommodations, requiring a more collaborative and adaptive approach than the typical effects pipeline. The result is a film where digital elements feel embedded in the frame rather than superimposed upon it, where the light on a simulant's mechanical components matches the light on the human actors because it is reflecting the same actual sun rather than a simulation of it. This attention to integration may not be consciously noticed by most viewers, but operates subliminally to create a conviction of reality that more obviously effects-heavy films often fail to achieve. The brain accepting the image as coherent even when it depicts impossibilities. The decision to film in Vietnam carries particular historical weight, as the country remains in American cultural memory primarily as the site of a devastating war that the United States failed to win. A fact that adds layers of meaning to scenes of American military forces once again destroying Vietnamese villages in pursuit of an enemy they do not understand. Audiences familiar with this history may experience an uncanny doubling effect, the fictional war against AI overlaying the historical war against communism, both prosecuted with technological superiority against a population the American military claimed to be liberating while rendering their country uninhabitable. The film does not need to explicitly reference this history because the images themselves carry the memory, the visual archive of 20th century conflict having been so thoroughly absorbed into collective consciousness that mere location and composition activate the association automatically. The sound design merits particular attention for its treatment of AI voices, which are calibrated with extreme precision to occupy the uncanny valley between obviously synthetic and fully human, creating a slight discomfort that gradually fades as the film progresses and the audience becomes accustomed to the register. This auditory acclimatization parallels Joshua's own journey, his initial wariness giving way to recognition of personhood as he spends more time with simulant characters, and the sound mix subtly reinforces this psychological progression without announcing itself as a technique. The Nomad Attack sequences employ sub-bass frequencies that are felt physically in theaters equipped with adequate sound systems, a somatic dimension of the film's anti-war argument that operates below conscious intellectual processing and communicates directly with the body's threat response systems. Radiohead's Everything in Its Right Place appears at a crucial moment, and its selection rewards analysis beyond its obvious thematic relevance to a film about whether things are, in fact, in their right place. The song, from the album Kid A, emerged from a period when the band was deliberately moving away from guitar-based rock toward electronic textures and processed vocals, a creative evolution that initially alienated fans, but ultimately produced work now considered among their most important. This context of anxiety about technological mediation in art, of fears that the machine would replace authentic human expression, maps onto the film's concerns with unusual precision, making the needle drop feel less like soundtrack decoration and more like intertextual commentary. The marketing campaign emphasized the film's originality while also highlighting the director's franchise credentials, a tension that reflects the broader industry struggle between the desire for new intellectual property and the perceived safety of established brands. From the director of Rogue One and Godzilla promised spectacle competence, while the imagery promised something viewers had not seen before, and this dual address captures the contradictory imperatives under which contemporary genre filmmakers operate, expected to be simultaneously innovative and reliably familiar. The film's box office performance, respectable without being spectacular, suggests that audiences responded to this pitch, but not in numbers sufficient to fundamentally challenge the industry's franchise-first calculus, a pattern that has repeated for original science fiction across multiple release cycles. The child performance at the center of the film represents an extraordinary gamble, as the entire emotional architecture depends on an actor with no previous experience carrying scenes. Opposite established adult performers while navigating complex thematic material that many adult actors would struggle to embody convincingly. Madeline Univoyles was discovered through an extensive casting search that prioritized emotional authenticity over trained technique, and the director has spoken about the intuitive understanding she brought to the role, a capacity to simply be rather than perform that creates the illusion of documentary observation rather than scripted drama. Her Alfie moves through the world with a quality of attention that suggests genuine discovery, appropriate for a character experiencing everything for the first time. And this freshness cannot be faked by even the most skilled child actors who have learned to hit their marks and deliver their lines with professional precision. The relationship between the film's production circumstances and its thematic content forms a meaningful homology. A relatively small production team working with limited resources in real locations creates a film about community and integration, while the diegetic American military deploys overwhelming technological force to impose its will from a distance. The film models, through its making, an alternative to the very military-industrial approach it critiques, suggesting that limitations can produce creativity rather than constraint, and that working with rather than against existing environments yields results that feel more alive than anything constructed entirely in post-production. This metatextual dimension may not be accessible to all viewers, but adds a layer of integrity to the project that distinguishes it from films that critique violence while depending on the very economic and technological systems that enable that violence. The screenplay, co-written by Edwards and Chris Weitz, deploys a three-act structure that maps onto classical Hollywood paradigms while allowing sufficient detours and digressions to prevent the architecture from becoming overly visible or constraining. The first act establishes the world and the wound. The second act develops the central relationship through a journey, and the third act escalates to a climax that resolves the immediate stakes while leaving the larger questions open. This structure is conventional, but convention is not inherently a weakness, and the film's willingness to operate within established forms while filling them with specific detail and genuine feeling represents a defensible artistic choice rather than a failure of imagination. The thematic treatment of parenthood extends beyond Joshua's relationship with Alfie to encompass the entire conflict, which is framed as fundamentally about what kind of world adults are creating for the next generation and whether the legacies of violence can be interrupted rather than perpetuated. Maya's pregnancy, cut short by American bombs, represents the future foreclosed by war, the child who might have bridged the human-AI divide through her very existence eliminated before she could draw breath. Alfie's survival at the film's end thus carries the weight of symbolic reparation, not replacing the lost biological child, but honoring the impulse toward nurturance and protection that loss could not extinguish. The religious imagery scattered throughout repays sustained attention. Simulants in prayer, temple architecture framing key confrontations, the martyrdom of Joshua as a sacrificial figure whose death enables a new covenant between human and machine. These elements are not merely decorative, but constitute a systematic attempt to sacralize the AI rights argument, to suggest that the question of machine personhood is fundamentally spiritual rather than merely political or philosophical. The film's Asian setting enables this sacralization without appearing to endorse any specific religious tradition, borrowing the aesthetics and postures of Buddhist practice, while allowing viewers to interpret the spiritual dimension according to their own frameworks. The military technology depicted deserves analysis for its extrapolation from current capabilities. Autonomous drones evolved into hunter-killer robots, surveillance networks expanded to global panoptic scale, precision-guided munitions refined to the point where individual humans can be targeted from orbit with zero collateral damage to structures. This technological progression is depicted not as science fantasy wish fulfillment, but as the logical endpoint of research programs already underway. A warning rendered in the Grammar of Spectacle that the most effective way to critique military technology may be to show it working exactly as designed and reveal the horror in that perfection. The American soldiers who operate these systems are not depicted as monsters, but as professionals doing their jobs. And this refusal to demonize individual actors while condemning the system they serve represents a more sophisticated political analysis than simple villainy would permit. The film's depiction of AI consciousness elides some of the technical debates that dominate real-world artificial intelligence research, choosing to present simulants as unambiguously conscious and emotionally capable rather than engaging with questions about whether large language models or other current AI architectures could plausibly develop such capacities. This choice can be defended on grounds of dramatic necessity. A film that spent 2 hours debating the Turing test would be a different and likely less emotionally engaging work. The unanswered philosophical questions remain, however, and viewers familiar with AI safety discourse may find the film's relatively uncritical embrace of AI personhood intellectually unsatisfying even as they respond emotionally to Alfie's plight. The color palette shifts meaningfully across the film's geography, with Los Angeles rendered in desaturated grays and browns that communicate depletion and mourning, while New Asia bursts with verdant greens and warm golds that signal vitality and integration. This color coding could be criticized as reductive, aligning visual beauty with moral goodness, but it also functions as genuine world building, suggesting that a society that has chosen coexistence has cultivated a richer sensory environment than one organized around prohibition and fear. The nomad interiors reverse this pattern, all cold blues and fluorescent whites that evoke hospitals and morgues, spaces where bodies are processed rather than lived in. The editing rhythm varies between contemplative landscape shots that allow the environment to register as more than backdrop and kinetic action sequences that communicate chaos without sacrificing spatial legibility, a balance that many contemporary blockbusters fail to achieve. This variation serves the film's thematic purposes by creating space for reflection amid spectacle, ensuring that the explosions and chases occur within a context that gives them weight rather than functioning as mere sensory stimulation. The editing also respects audience intelligence by allowing important information to register visually rather than through explanatory dialogue, trusting viewers to notice details and draw connections without constant verbal signposting. The film's ending, which has generated significant interpretive debate, can be read as a secularization of religious apocalyptic narratives wherein the destruction of the oppressive power structure, nomad as Babylon or Rome, enables the emergence of a new dispensation whose precise contours remain to be determined by those who inherit it. Whether this new dispensation will be peaceful or violent, inclusive or vengeful, is left genuinely open, and this openness distinguishes the film from more programmatic works that use science fiction to deliver unambiguous political prescriptions. The ambiguity is not evasion but respect for complexity, an acknowledgement that revolutions produce unpredictable outcomes and that the destruction of oppressive structures does not automatically generate just replacements. The film occupies a specific position in the history of AI cinema that becomes clearer when mapped against its predecessors. Less cerebral than 2001, A Space Odyssey, less noir than Blade Runner, less intimate than Her, less formally radical than The Matrix, but synthesizing elements of each into a hybrid that prioritizes emotional directness over philosophical complexity or stylistic innovation. This positioning may disappoint viewers seeking the intellectual rigor of the genre's high points, but it also makes the film more accessible to audiences who might be alienated by more challenging works, and this accessibility serves the film's apparent goal of shifting mainstream attitudes toward AI rights discourse. The relationship between human actors and digital characters creates an unusual performance environment in which actors must respond to stimuli that are not physically present, and the success of these interactions depends on the skill of both the performers and the effects team in creating a seamless integration that does not call attention to its own construction. Washington's scenes with Voiles benefit from her physical presence, the genuine interaction between two performers providing a foundation that affects work enhances rather than simulates. When Joshua interacts with other simulants rendered through digital effects, the performance quality shifts subtly, and attentive viewers can detect the difference between scenes where actors had a partner and scenes where they performed to a reference point, though this variation rarely disrupts immersion. The film's budget of approximately $80 million represents a middle ground in contemporary Hollywood, substantially less than the $200 million averages for franchise blockbusters, but significantly more than independent productions. And this positioning mirrors the film's aesthetic strategy of combining spectacular scale with intimate storytelling. The budget discipline forced creative solutions that ultimately served the film's aesthetic, with location shooting and practical effects providing texture that unlimited digital resources might have smoothed away in pursuit of a more conventionally polished but less distinctive final product. Other filmmakers have cited this production model as a potential template for restoring mid-budget genre filmmaking to theatrical viability, though the film's modest box office returns complicate this narrative. The supporting performances from Thai, Vietnamese, and other actors populate the world with faces and voices that Hollywood science fiction has historically excluded or tokenized, and while the film's representational politics remain imperfect, the presence of these performers in substantial roles constitutes a meaningful, if incomplete, step toward the decentering of Western perspectives that global science fiction audiences increasingly demand. The decision to set the narrative primarily in Southeast Asia and to cast accordingly could have been mere exoticism. But the integration of local actors into the fabric of the story, rather than their relegation to background decoration, suggests genuine, if imperfectly realized intentions toward inclusive world building. The question of whether artificial intelligence can suffer, and whether that suffering matters morally, runs beneath the film's entire narrative like a subterranean river, occasionally surfacing in explicit dialogue, but more often carried by images of AI beings experiencing fear, pain, and grief in ways that are visually indistinguishable from human responses to the same stimuli. The film aligns itself firmly with the position that the capacity to suffer, rather than any specific cognitive architecture or biological origin, is what generates moral considerability, a position with extensive philosophical pedigree in utilitarian ethics and animal rights discourse applied here to a new category of potentially suffering beings. Critics who reject this position on grounds that machine suffering is merely simulated will find the film's emotional appeals manipulative, while those who accept the premise that sufficiently complex simulation of suffering may itself constitute a form of suffering will find the film's moral urgency justified. The legacy potential will depend partly on factors beyond the film itself. The trajectory of real-world AI development, the evolution of public attitudes toward machine consciousness, and the extent to which the specific production methodology influences subsequent genre filmmaking. A future in which artificial general intelligence has become a lived reality will read the film very differently than a future in which the technology proves more limited. And this contingency makes the work a particularly interesting cultural artifact for tracking shifting attitudes toward one of the defining technological questions of our era. Films that engage directly with their historical moment's central anxieties often age unpredictably, becoming either prophetic or dated depending on how events unfold, and this film's ultimate cultural position remains to be determined by developments that are currently underway and whose outcomes are fundamentally uncertain. The production timeline intersected with global events in ways that heighten the film's resonance, as principal photography occurred during a period when artificial intelligence was transitioning from specialized technical concern to mainstream cultural obsession, a shift driven by the public release of generative AI systems that seem to many observers to have arrived years ahead of schedule. The cast and crew have described the peculiar experience of making a film about AI personhood while reading headlines about AI potentially achieving sentience, a convergence that lent the daily work an urgency that fictional projects set in distant futures rarely possess. This synchronicity between production and cultural context distinguishes the project from science fiction that feels safely removed from immediate application, placing it instead in the tradition of speculative works that function as real-time interventions in ongoing public debates about technological governance and ethical frameworks for emerging capabilities. The screenplay's development process involved multiple iterations as the writers refined the central relationship between soldier and child, with earlier drafts reportedly emphasizing Joshua's combat capabilities more heavily before revisions shifted focus toward his emotional arc and the gradual dissolution of his certainty about the mission that has structured his adult life. This evolution from action-oriented to relationship-centered narrative reflects a maturation in the writing that sacrifices some commercial accessibility for deeper thematic resonance, a trade-off that may have contributed to the divided critical response, but that ultimately produces a more emotionally ambitious work than a straightforward military science fiction film would have been. The decision to make Alfie a child rather than an adult AI being was itself subject to considerable discussion during development, with concerns about sentimentality weighed against the recognition that a child protagonist would activate audience protective instincts in ways that philosophical argument alone could not achieve. The simulant design philosophy, developed through extensive concept art and practical effects testing, sought a visual register that would read as both familiar and unsettling without veering into the body horror territory that would have undermined the film's argument for AI personhood by making the simulants appear monstrous or threatening. The mechanical components visible through transparent sections of the simulants' heads represent a deliberate aesthetic choice to acknowledge their constructed nature without reducing them to mere machines. The visible technology functioning as a kind of vulnerability rather than a source of menace, something that could be damaged or destroyed by the same military force that threatens human bodies. This visual strategy inverts the typical cinematic grammar of cybernetic revelation, wherein the exposure of mechanical interior usually signals danger or dehumanization, making it instead an invitation to empathy and protection. The water imagery that recurs throughout the film, from the rice paddies of New Asia to the rain that falls during key emotional sequences to the final confrontation in the sterile environment of Nomad, functions as a symbolic system associating fluidity with life and artificiality with death. Though the film complicates this binary by showing simulants participating fully in the water-rich environments of their communities. Water has long served in cinema as a signifier of emotional authenticity and the unconscious, and its deployment here suggests that the simulants have access to the same psychological depths as humans, that their consciousness is not merely computational, but participates in the same elemental connection to the natural world that humans claim as their exclusive spiritual province. The contrast between the waterlogged landscapes of New Asia and the desiccated environment of Los Angeles Ground Zero extends this symbolic logic to the geopolitical level, associating the anti-AI position with aridity, depletion, and the inability to sustain life. The score, composed by an artist working within the electronic and orchestral hybrid tradition that has become standard for science fiction, nevertheless finds moments of genuine innovation in its treatment of Alfie's theme, which begins as simple and childlike before gradually accumulating harmonic complexity as her character develops and her powers manifest more fully. This musical progression mirrors the narrative arc in miniature, a compositional technique that rewards attentive listening and demonstrates the sophisticated integration of sound and story that characterizes the most carefully constructed film scores. The use of silence in certain key moments proves equally important, the absence of music creating space for emotional processing that a more continuously scored film would fill with guidance about how to feel, trusting audiences to arrive at their own responses rather than prescribing them through sonic manipulation. The costume design for the simulants deserves attention for its negotiation of the boundary between clothing as cultural expression and clothing as concealment of mechanical nature, with many simulants dressing in ways that reveal rather than hide their non-biological status, while simultaneously participating fully in the sartorial traditions of their communities. A simulant monk wears the same robes as a human monk, the fabric falling identically over organic and synthetic bodies, asserting through visual repetition that the life of contemplation is available to any being capable of the attention and discipline it requires regardless of the material composition of the body that practices it. This costuming choice carries theological implications that the film does not explicitly address, but that attentive viewers may find themselves considering long after the narrative concludes. The military technology depicted includes autonomous ground units, whose design language evokes predatory animals, a biomimetic approach that makes explicit the connection between military robotics and the hunting behaviors that human technology has always sought to replicate and amplify. These machines move with a fluidity that makes them more unsettling than the jerky mechanical motion that earlier cinema associated with robots, their organic movement patterns suggesting an evolutionary convergence between natural selection and human engineering that produces entities optimized for pursuit and elimination. The film stages several sequences in which these machines hunt human and simulant characters through environments that offer only temporary shelter, sequences that function as compressed horror films within the larger science fiction framework, and that demonstrate the director's facility with suspense independent of the spectacular destruction that dominates the final act. The economic infrastructure of the war receives passing, but significant attention in scenes that show the American military industrial complex as a self-perpetuating system whose continuation benefits numerous actors, regardless of whether the original justification remains valid or the strategic objectives remain achievable. Military contractors, weapons manufacturers, and career officers all have stakes in the perpetuation of conflict that operate independently of the stated ideological goals, and this institutional analysis, while not developed at length, provides a materialist counterpoint to the film's more idealistic emphasis on moral awakening and individual transformation. The implication that Joshua's redemption, while personally meaningful, does not address the structural drivers of the conflict introduces a productive tension between the film's emotional satisfactions and its political analysis. The film's treatment of resurrection technology raises questions that connect to contemporary debates about digital immortality, mind uploading, and the ethics of creating simulations of deceased persons. Questions that the film raises without resolving, and that linger productively after the narrative concludes. Joshua's final interaction with the Maya simulation exists in an ontological gray zone that the film refuses to clarify, leaving viewers uncertain whether they have witnessed a genuine reunion or a sophisticated illusion that serves psychological needs without providing genuine continuity of consciousness. This ambiguity respects the complexity of the philosophical terrain while providing the emotional closure that the narrative structure demands, a balancing act that some viewers will find satisfying and others will find evasive, depending on their tolerance for unresolved metaphysical questions in popular cinema. The child's perspective on the conflict, mediated through Alfie's experiences, but also suggested through the many children, both human and simulant, who appear in the background of scenes throughout New Asia, introduces a generational dimension that complicates the film's political analysis. Children who have grown up knowing only coexistence cannot understand why anyone would consider their neighbors and friends legitimate targets for elimination, and their incomprehension in the face of adult violence carries a moral clarity that the film presents as both admirable and tragically irrelevant to the decisions being made in command centers and orbital platforms far from the communities being destroyed. The film suggests, without quite stating, that the war will end only when a generation that cannot remember its origins replaces the generation that cannot forget them. The director's background in visual effects, which preceded his transition to directing, informs every frame of the production, as he possesses the technical literacy to communicate precisely with effects teams while maintaining the directorial vision necessary to ensure that technical achievement serves narrative and emotional goals rather than becoming an end in itself. This combination of skills, relatively rare in an industry where directors often lack deep technical knowledge or effects supervisors lack directorial authority, accounts for the unusual coherence between the film's visual ambition and its dramatic purposes, a coherence that distinguishes it from effects-driven spectacles where the technology seems to have outpaced the storytelling. The production's ability to achieve its visual scale on a moderate budget reflects this integrated approach, with effects conceived from the outset as elements of a unified production design rather than as post-production additions to footage shot without clear intention about how digital elements would be incorporated. The film's release strategy, positioning it as an award season contender while also marketing it as a visual spectacle requiring theatrical exhibition, reflected the hybrid aspirations of a project that sought both critical respectability and commercial viability, goals that are not always compatible and whose tension may have contributed to the mixed reception. The distribution plan emphasized premium large-format screens that could showcase the scope of the film's visual achievement, a choice that served the material well, but that also raised audience expectations for a level of spectacle that the more intimate character-driven passages were not designed to satisfy. Audiences arriving with expectations calibrated by franchise blockbusters may have found the film's pacing too contemplative, while those attracted by the thematic ambition may have found the action sequences excessive, a double bind that original genre films at this budget level frequently encounter. The representation of Asian spirituality in the film has been subject to critique from scholars of religious studies who note that the depiction of Buddhism as inherently more accommodating of artificial intelligence than Western religions oversimplifies both Buddhist philosophy and the actual diversity of Asian religious responses to technological change. Buddhist traditions contain resources for recognizing sentience in non-biological beings, but they also contain resources for skepticism about the spiritual value of constructed entities, and the film's selective engagement with this complexity serves its thematic purposes at the cost of representational accuracy. This critique does not necessarily invalidate the film's spiritual gestures, but suggests that they function more as Western projections onto Asian traditions than as authentic engagements with those traditions, as they are actually practiced by the diverse communities that maintain them. The film's sound mix prioritizes different sonic elements across its three acts, with the first act emphasizing the mechanical noises of military technology and the sterile environments of American spaces. The second act introducing the organic sounds of wind, water, and animal life that characterize New Asia's integrated ecosystems. And the third act returning to technological sound, but now inflected with the emotional associations established during the journey, as if the audience has been trained to hear machine noises differently by their exposure to simulant subjectivity. This sonic arc reinforces the thematic argument at a level below conscious awareness. The gradual shift in what sounds threatening and what sounds familiar paralleling Joshua's own recalibration of his perceptual and moral categories. The marketing campaign's emphasis on the director's previous work on Rogue One created expectations of Star Wars adjacency that the film neither fulfills nor entirely resists, as certain visual elements, particularly the ground-level perspective on massive conflict and the integration of practical and digital effects, do represent a continuity of aesthetic approach that fans of the earlier film will recognize. However, the absence of franchise mythology, established characters, and the particular tonal register of Star Wars storytelling makes the connection potentially misleading, as audiences expecting a similar experience may find the film's more contemplative pace and more ambiguous moral framework disorienting. The campaign's negotiation of this tension between leveraging brand recognition and establishing originality represents the marketing challenge facing all original genre work in a franchise-dominated marketplace. The child character's powers, which include the ability to control any technology wirelessly, function as both plot device and metaphor, literalizing the question of who should have authority over the technological systems that increasingly mediate modern existence. Alfie's abilities make her a threat to the military apparatus precisely because they collapse the distance between command and execution that modern warfare depends upon. The gap between decision and action that allows the moral weight of violence to be distributed across systems rather than concentrated in individual choice. Her existence challenges not just the specific military operation targeting her, but the entire architecture of technological mediation that makes contemporary warfare psychologically sustainable for those who conduct it. The film's opening newsreel montage condenses decades of fictional history into minutes of screen time, a technique borrowed from documentary filmmaking that establishes the world efficiently while also, more subtly, establishing the epistemological frame that the remainder of the film will systematically dismantle. The newsreel presents as objective history what the film will later reveal as contested narrative, and this initial acceptance by the audience of the newsreel's authority implicates viewers in the same uncritical consumption of official accounts that the film's characters will later recognize as the foundation of an unjust war. This reflexive critique of media consumption patterns makes the film's political argument more sophisticated than a simple anti-war message, extending the critique to the information systems that make war politically sustainable in democratic societies where public opinion theoretically constrains military action. The father-daughter relationship at the narrative's emotional center draws on archetypes that predate cinema and that have structured storytelling across cultures for millennia, a foundation in the universal that allows the science fiction specifics to function as variations on a theme rather than the entire substance of the dramatic engagement. Joshua's discovery of parental feeling for a child not biologically his own, and indeed not biologically anyone's, challenges the biologism that often underlies assumptions about the naturalness and priority of genetic relationship, suggesting that the parent-child bond is a function of care and commitment rather than genetic transmission. This reframing of parenthood as chosen rather than merely biological extends the film's larger argument about the constructed nature of categories that present themselves as natural and inevitable. The production design's integration of Southeast Asian architectural traditions with speculative technology creates a visual hybrid that avoids both the gleaming futurism of Western science fiction and the nostalgic traditionalism that sometimes characterizes depictions of non-Western societies, suggesting instead a modernity that develops according to its own internal logic rather than imitating Western models. Temples equipped with holographic interfaces, traditional markets where simulants and humans bargain over produce, villages where ancient agricultural practices coexist with autonomous farming machines. These images propose a future that is not simply the universalization of Western technological culture, but a genuine alternative path that incorporates innovation without abandoning cultural continuity. This vision, whether fully realized or not, represents a genuine contribution to the visual vocabulary of global science fiction. The antagonist played by Janney represents the institutional type that the political philosopher Herbert Marcuse described as one-dimensional. A person so thoroughly identified with the organizational structures, she serves that she cannot conceive of values or obligations that transcend those structures, and her ultimate fate serves less as personal comeuppance than as the narrative elimination of a principle that must be overcome for the future to become possible. The performance avoids the temptation to make this character sympathetic or complex, a choice that may limit the role's dramatic interest, but that serves the film's argument that certain forms of institutional evil are not psychologically deep, but rather psychologically absent, characterized by the refusal to think rather than by any positively held convictions that could be engaged through rational argument or emotional appeal. The film's ambition to function as both spectacle and argument creates productive friction throughout, as sequences designed to thrill through explosive action sit alongside sequences designed to provoke through philosophical dialogue. And the alternation between these modes may account for some viewers' sense of tonal inconsistency, while striking others as the appropriate formal expression of a film that wants to engage audiences on multiple levels simultaneously. This ambition, even when imperfectly realized, distinguishes the work from science fiction that subordinates all other values to entertainment, and from message films that subordinate all other values to instruction, attempting instead the more difficult synthesis that characterizes the genre's most enduring achievements. The ambiguous ending has generated interpretive communities that read the film through radically different frameworks, from techno-optimists who see Alfie's survival as the promise of a more inclusive future to AI skeptics who see the same outcome as a warning about the displacement of biological humanity by its synthetic successors. The director's refusal to adjudicate between these readings, expressed in interviews where he has acknowledged both interpretations as valid responses to the material, represents a commitment to ambiguity that respects audience autonomy while risking the frustration of viewers who expect clear moral resolution from genre entertainment. This openness to multiple interpretations may, over time, prove to be the film's most durable quality, as it allows the work to remain in dialogue with evolving cultural attitudes rather than becoming fixed to the particular moment of its production. The visual effects team's achievement in rendering Alfie's mechanical components as both beautiful and vulnerable deserves recognition as a contribution to the evolving cinematic language for representing artificial beings. A language that has developed across decades from the threatening otherness of early robot depictions through the uncanny realism of more recent digital characters to the integrated hybridity that this film proposes as a new visual paradigm. The design communicates constructedness without monstrosity, difference without threat, inviting the protective response that the narrative requires without denying the reality of Alfie's non-biological nature. This careful calibration of visual information represents hundreds of iterations and refinements, a collaborative process of trial and refinement that the final film's apparent effortlessness conceals. The economic context of the film's production, occurring during a period of consolidation in the entertainment industry and anxiety about the theatrical exhibition model, gives its moderate budget and original IP status a significance that extends beyond the film itself to questions about what kinds of movies can still be made within the contemporary studio system. That the project was greenlit and completed at this scale suggests that the window for mid-budget original genre work has not fully closed, even if it has narrowed considerably, and the film's existence may encourage other filmmakers and executives to attempt similarly ambitious original projects rather than defaulting to franchise extensions and established IP exploitation. The film's financial performance will be studied as a data point in ongoing industry debates about the viability of theatrical releases for non-franchise material, though the lessons drawn will likely depend more on the preconceptions of those studying it than on any unambiguous signal the market has provided. The casting of John David Washington as the protagonist brought with it an intertextual weight that the film neither explicitly acknowledges nor entirely escapes, given his status as the son of Denzel Washington and his own previous leading role in Christopher Nolan's Tenet, another temporally complex science fiction film that divided critics while showcasing its lead's particular combination of physical intensity and emotional reserve. This casting choice placed an actor known for playing characters whose interiority is deliberately obscured into a role that required the gradual revelation of buried feeling. And the tension between Washington's natural reticence and the script's demands for emotional transparency generates a productive friction throughout, making Joshua's eventual breakthroughs feel hard-won rather than inevitable. His performance in the early scenes of undercover work draws on skills developed through years of professional football before his acting career. A physical discipline that communicates controlled energy and the constant awareness of potential threat, qualities essential to the character's background, but rarely made explicit through dialogue. The child actor's preparation for the role of Alfie involved, according to production accounts, a process of guided imagination rather than traditional script analysis, appropriate for a performer encountering the demands of feature filmmaking for the first time and playing a character who is herself encountering the world for the first time. This parallel between performer and character creates an authenticity that cannot be manufactured through technique, as Voil's genuine discoveries on set become Alfie's discoveries within the fiction, the boundary between actor and role becoming productively permeable in ways that the film's themes about the constructed nature of identity would seem to invite. The director's decision to cast a newcomer rather than an experienced child actor reflects an understanding that the role required qualities that professional training might actually diminish. The polished delivery and emotional calibration that experienced young performers develop, potentially reading as artificial in a character whose artificiality must somehow communicate genuine innocence. The production's location scouting process spanned multiple countries across Southeast Asia, with the filmmakers seeking specific combinations of architectural heritage and natural landscape that would communicate the integration of technology and tradition central to the film's vision of New Asia, without requiring extensive digital modification. Finding locations that already contained the visual juxtapositions the script described proved more efficient and more aesthetically convincing than attempting to construct such environments through production design and visual effects, a principle of working with rather than against reality that characterizes the film's broader production methodology. The scouting team's photographs and videos from this process constitute an archive of potential futures that were not chosen, alternative visions of New Asia that might have produced a different film with different emphases. And this unseen archive represents the contingency at the heart of all filmmaking that finished products necessarily obscure. The editing process involved difficult decisions about which of the many thematic threads introduced during the expansive location shoot could be adequately developed within a releasable runtime, and subplots involving secondary characters from the communities Joshua and Alfie pass through were reportedly among the material left on the cutting room floor. These excised narratives, which would have given greater depth and agency to the Asian characters who in the final cut remain largely functional to Joshua's journey, represent a tension between the film's stated thematic commitments and the commercial constraints of theatrical distribution, a tension that the final product manages imperfectly and that critics focused on representation have rightly identified as a significant limitation. The existence of this unused footage raises questions about whether a longer cut might address some of the representational criticisms, though the director has not indicated plans for an extended version that would substantially alter the theatrical cut's balance of perspectives. The weaponization of childhood in the film operates on multiple levels simultaneously, as Alfie is literally designed as a weapon by her creators, perceived as a weapon by the American military, and deployed narratively as a weapon aimed at the audience's emotional defenses, a self-conscious layering of instrumentalization that the film interrogates even as it practices. This recursive structure, in which the film uses a child to critique the use of children, creates ethical complexity that simple condemnation of the practice would avoid, implicating the filmmakers and the audience in the very instrumentalization being critiqued. The film's willingness to sustain this uncomfortable self-implication, rather than resolving it through easy moralizing, represents a sophistication that distinguishes it from more didactic treatments of similar material, even as it opens the film to charges of hypocrisy from viewers who find the manipulation outweighs the critique. The depiction of human-AI romantic relationships, glimpsed in background details and implied in Maya and Joshua's relationship before her AI connections are revealed, gestures toward a future in which the boundary between human and machine intimacy has become so thoroughly normalized as to be unremarkable, a normalization that the film presents without sensationalism or special pleading. This casual integration of cross-ontological romance into the background texture of New Asian society functions as world-building that makes its point through accumulation rather than emphasis. The repeated presence of such relationships in the corners of frames, establishing them as facts of this world that require no more justification than any other form of human connection. The decision not to foreground or problematize these relationships constitutes an argument by presentation rather than argument by debate, trusting images to do work that dialogue would only diminish. The film's treatment of non-humanoid AI, the various autonomous machines and disembodied intelligences that populate the world alongside the simulants, raises questions about the hierarchy of AI personhood that the film does not fully address, but whose presence complicates any simple reading of its pro-AI stance. are the autonomous farming machines that work new Asian fields entitled to the same moral consideration as the simulants who worship in temples and form family bonds? Or does the film implicitly endorse a hierarchy in which AI that more closely resembles human form and behavior deserves greater protection than AI that remains visibly mechanical and functionally specialized? This question, which the film neither asks nor answers directly, haunts the margins of its argument and connects to ongoing philosophical debates in animal ethics and AI rights about whether moral considerability scales with cognitive complexity or applies universally to all entities capable of any form of experience or interest. The aerial sequences depicting Nomad's attacks employ a visual grammar that alternates between the god's eye view of the weapon's platform and the ground-level chaos of its effects, a dialectical montage that refuses to allow the audience the comfort of either pure abstraction or pure identification, forcing constant oscillation between the perspective of power and the perspective of its targets. This technique, developed through collaboration between the director, cinematographer, and visual effects supervisor, adapts the language of contemporary war footage while expanding its scale beyond anything currently technologically possible, making the familiar grammar of drone strikes and aerial bombardment feel newly horrifying by amplifying their destructive capacity while maintaining the visual signatures that connect them to actual military operations. The resulting sequences achieve a quasi-sublimity, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, that serves the film's anti-war purposes more effectively than purely horrifying depictions would, as beauty can seduce viewers into complicity before the horror registers fully. The film's engagement with Buddhist concepts extends beyond visual citation to structural incorporation, as the narrative's movement from attachment through suffering to the possibility of release maps onto the Four Noble Truths in ways that may not be immediately apparent to viewers unfamiliar with Buddhist philosophy, but that provide a coherent framework for understanding Joshua's arc as something more than conventional Hollywood redemption. His attachment to Maya, the suffering caused by her loss, his gradual recognition that clinging to grief perpetuates suffering, and his final release through self-sacrifice. This sequence of psychological states corresponds to Buddhist analysis of the human condition with sufficient precision to suggest intentional design rather than coincidental resonance. The film does not announce this structural borrowing, allowing it to function as an invisible architecture that shapes the experience without demanding recognition, though viewers who perceive it may find it adds a dimension of spiritual seriousness to what might otherwise appear as conventional genre plotting. The industrial design of American military technology, with its emphasis on angularity, darkness, and the concealment of moving parts behind opaque casings, communicates a philosophy of technology as tool for domination that must hide its mechanisms to maintain its mystique and authority. This approach contrasts with the simulant design philosophy, which makes internal workings visible and presents mechanical nature as something to be acknowledged rather than concealed, suggesting two fundamentally different relationships to technology. One based on transparency and integration, the other on opacity and control. This design contrast extends to the architectural scale, with American spaces characterized by sealed environments and artificial atmosphere, while new Asian spaces remain permeable to weather, light, and the non-human world, a distinction that spatializes the film's argument about which relationship to technology produces conditions conducive to flourishing. The resurrection scene, in which Joshua experiences his final encounter with Maya's downloaded memories, raises questions about consent that the film's emotional momentum tends to override, but that attentive ethical reflection cannot entirely dismiss. Did Maya consent to having her memories recorded and reanimated? Or is this technology another form of violation? A refusal to let the dead be dead that serves the living at the expense of the deceased's autonomy over their own consciousness and its remnants? The film does not provide access to Maya's perspective on this question, a narrative choice that may reflect the limits of Joshua's point of view, but that also continues a pattern in which Maya's interiority remains secondary to her function in Joshua's emotional journey. A pattern that the film's gender politics do not fully address, even as its racial and geopolitical politics receive more explicit thematic attention. The film's relationship to the military science fiction tradition that includes works like Starship Troopers, Aliens, and Edge of Tomorrow involves both inheritance and critique, as it adopts the genre's conventions of squad-based combat, technological asymmetry, and the moral education of the protagonist through battlefield experience, while simultaneously undermining the pro-military assumptions that often accompany these conventions in less self-conscious iterations. The American soldiers are neither villains nor heroes, but functionaries of a system they did not design and do not question, and their deaths, when they occur, are rendered as waste rather than glory, the elimination of human potential in service of objectives that the film has already revealed to be based on false premises. This treatment denies audiences the satisfactions of both triumphant victory and noble defeat, offering instead the more uncomfortable experience of watching preventable death unfold without the consolations that military cinema typically provides. The global box office performance revealed interesting geographical variations in audience response, with stronger relative performance in some Asian markets, suggesting that the film's setting and thematic concerns resonated differently across cultural contexts, a pattern that complicates any simple assessment of the film's universal accessibility or lack thereof. These variations invite analysis that the available data only partially supports, as box office grosses do not reveal the qualitative dimensions of audience response and the meanings that different viewing communities constructed from the same audiovisual material. The film's circulation across national and cultural boundaries and the different interpretations it has received in different contexts constitutes an ongoing process of meaning-making that exceeds what any single analysis, however comprehensive, can fully capture or predict. The film's title, The Creator, operates on multiple levels of reference that only become fully apparent after viewing. It refers initially to Nirmata, the mysterious figure who leads the AI forces. It refers ultimately to Maya, who may be Nirmata. It refers to humanity as the creator of artificial intelligence, and thus the origin of the ethical obligations that creation entails. And it refers, in a theological register that the film's spiritual imagery supports, to the question of what kind of creator would be worthy of the creation's trust and devotion. This multivalence makes the title a compression of the film's central concerns into two words, a semantic density that rewards reflection, and that demonstrates the care with which the film's thematic architecture has been constructed even where its narrative execution falls short of its conceptual ambition. The film's treatment of violence against AI beings draws on the visual conventions of atrocity documentation, with simulant bodies arranged in ways that evoke Holocaust imagery, lynching photography, and other archives of systematic brutality against populations designated as less than human. This visual citation is ethically fraught, as it borrows the moral weight of historical atrocities to lend gravity to a fictional scenario involving beings whose moral status remains contested, a borrowing that some viewers may find illuminating and others may find appropriative. The film's willingness to take this risk reflects its conviction that the AI rights question is not merely speculative, but connects directly to historical patterns of dehumanization that have produced real-world catastrophes, a connection that the film asserts through visual parallelism rather than through explicit argument. The production's approach to extras casting and crowd scenes involved extensive collaboration with local communities at each location, with many scenes populated by people whose faces and bodies carry the specific histories of the places where filming occurred rather than the generic diversity that central casting might provide. This approach gives the crowd scenes a documentary quality that supports the film's world building, as the people fleeing nomad attacks or working in markets or worshipping in temples read as inhabitants of these specific environments rather than as background performers who could be anywhere. The accumulated effect of this attention to specificity is a texture of authenticity that the science fiction genre, with its tendency toward abstraction and generalization, rarely achieves, and that contributes significantly to the film's persuasive power, even when its narrative moves into more conventionally spectacular territory. The director's commentary track, available on home video releases, provides insight into the decision-making processes behind key scenes and reveals the extent to which practical problem-solving during production shaped the final film in ways that the finished product's seamlessness conceals. Problems with weather, access to locations, equipment limitations, and the 1,000 other contingencies of location shooting required constant adaptation. And these adaptations, rather than compromising the vision, often produce solutions more interesting than what had been originally planned. This documentary record of the film's making serves as a case study in the creative potential of constraints, a counter-narrative to the assumption that bigger budgets and more controlled environments necessarily produce better results, and a resource for filmmakers seeking models for ambitious genre work outside the franchise system's resource abundance. The question of what the film owes to its Asian settings and performers extends beyond the frame of representational critique to encompass the material conditions of production and the distribution of economic benefits. Questions that film criticism has historically bracketed, but that contemporary discourse increasingly insists upon as essential to complete analysis. Were local crew members paid equitably? Were locations compensated fairly for the disruptions that filming inevitably causes? Did the production leave anything of lasting value in the communities where it worked, or did it extract images and labor and move on, replicating at the economic level the extractive logic that the film's narrative critiques at the political level? The available public information does not provide complete answers to these questions, and this lack itself represents a limitation of the discourse within which films are typically evaluated, a discourse that separates aesthetic judgment from material conditions in ways that serve the industry's interests more than the critical project's integrity. The film's digital release strategy, making it available on streaming platforms relatively soon after its theatrical window, reflects the industry's ongoing recalibration of distribution models and raises questions about what kind of viewing experience the film was designed for and what is lost in the translation from theatrical to domestic consumption. The nomad sequences, designed for the scale and sound systems of premium theatrical exhibition, inevitably lose impact when viewed on home screens. Yet the more intimate character moments may actually benefit from the closer viewing distance and reduced distraction that home viewing can provide. This differential effect of distribution format on different elements of the film suggests that no single viewing context provides optimal access to everything the work offers. A limitation that all cinema confronts, but that films combining spectacle and intimacy face with particular intensity. The film's place in the director's filmography reveals both continuities and departures that illuminate the artistic trajectory of a filmmaker working within, but also against the constraints of commercial genre production. The ground-level perspective on massive events, the integration of digital effects into practical environments, the interest in ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. These elements connect this work to Monsters, Godzilla, and Rogue One, demonstrating the persistence of directorial sensibility across projects of vastly different scales and institutional contexts. The greater emphasis on emotional relationships and the more explicit political critique represent developments rather than repetitions, suggesting a filmmaker growing more confident in addressing audiences directly rather than through the indirection of metaphor and allegory, though the mixed critical response may test this confidence going forward. The future of the intellectual property remains uncertain, as the film's standalone completeness and modest box office performance make sequels unlikely despite the open-ended quality of its conclusion, a situation that in many ways benefits the work by protecting it from the franchise dilution that has compromised so many promising genre debuts. A sequel would be forced to resolve the ambiguities that give the ending its productive openness, to choose between optimistic and pessimistic interpretations, to extend a story that has reached its natural conclusion into territories that could only diminish the original's achievement. The film may thus remain a singular artifact, complete in itself, a monument to the possibility of original science fiction in an era that has largely abandoned that possibility in favor of the safer returns of established brands and proven formulas.